We would like to welcome all of our listeners to a special edition of the Braver Angels podcast. My name is Luke Phillips. I am the editor of the written opinion essay content on Braver Angels Media, and I'm joined here by 6 of our illustrious writers who have written a lot of interesting stuff for us, especially in the last couple weeks and months, but we'll be writing a lot more interesting things for you moving forward. So in no particular order, I am joined by Justin Naylor, who is our columnist of ours, writing from central Pennsylvania, where in his real life, he actually owns Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, a bed and breakfast farm, right?
Not bed and breakfast, but a farm. We raise vegetables, and we also operate a small restaurant in the farm, on the farm, in the farmhouse, on Fridays and Saturday nights.
Our writer who literally owns a restaurant, so he does more cool stuff than most of the rest of us combined. Michael Harrington, who is a data analyst and social scientist based in Los Angeles, California, who's written a lot of interesting stuff for us on the kind of psychological profile of red and blue. So Michael, is that reasonably accurate, or?
Well, I'm a political scientist, and I've studied polarization from that point of view, from the scientific point of view, the political scientific point of view, and I write on that. I'm a social scientist, so I study psychology a lot. But
he also wrote one of the most interesting older pieces on our page called let's see if I remember the name. How and Why We're Polarized, and it was a geographic analysis of the county by county results of. Yeah,
that's basically my academic work that I did on this, and it's not really my field, but I first found the polarization that's happened after the 2000 election and 2004 election to be quite interesting and quite counterintuitive to what I was reading in the newspapers.
Well, as we approach the 2020 election, it's going to be relevant even ever more so as well.
Oh yeah, it's not much has really changed.
Yeah,
it's gotten worse.
We are also joined by Ruth Ashkenazi. She is a personal trainer,
fitness therapist, kind of straddling the personal trainer and physical therapist realm.
Okay, great. And she's based in the Bay Area of California. So she wrote a piece for us about a month and a half ago or so, just a dispatch on some of the great work that Braver Angels has been doing up in the Bay Area. So thank you for that, Ruth. We are also joined by 3 of our wonderful social media strategists, including Greg Steinbrecher. Greg is also based in Los Angeles, and he's written a lot of interesting things on free speech and the question of liberty versus collectivism for us. So he is one of our fascinating theoretical writers on that front, and he also has a really good sense of humor on the social media page as well, if I must speak for myself. So Greg, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you, sir.
We're joined by Randy Leoz, who is one of the oldest, one of the longest serving members of Braver Angels, here since almost literally the beginning. And he's right now pioneering a lot of Braver Angels' online resources and online offerings for the national organization, as well as writing excellent stuff on how progressives and how people on the left look at or should look at polarization. Some of his pieces have been really, really fascinating. So Randy, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
And we are finally joined by James Coan, who's a depolarization strategist and consultant based in Washington, D.C., who has been doing a lot of work recently, especially on the field of national unity. I have had the pleasure of attending various events that he's organized among the policy communities depolarizing entrepreneurs in the nation's capital as well. So James, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Luke.
So with that, Greg, since you're kind of the brains behind this whole operation, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Luke, and thanks for being an editor extraordinaire. A main reason I wanted to do this, I think we have an interesting and talented stable of writers that do great work pretty regularly on the website, and that because we're all so disparate, we're living all over the country. We don't get a chance too often to come together and discuss issues and form a sense of community that I think could be really beneficial. And I think we obviously all come from different perspectives and we all offer different ideas, but we're able to communicate those ideas in a way that's not antagonistic and interesting. So I just think this will be a fun discussion. I think before we sort of jump into some of the issues, I know we wanted to talk a little bit about Trump's comments lately, which, everything that happens day to day probably will get washed away in terms of the grand scope of history. Like what Trump says at a news conference isn't really all that noteworthy, but it raises some interesting issues. But before that happens, does everybody want to maybe go around the circle a little bit, talk about a piece that they wrote recently on the website, and then sort of give an overview of your work? I think that could be an interesting way, because almost everyone here has written something recently, as in the last week or two. And if you haven't, maybe talk about the last piece you wrote, because there's been some really great stuff on the website lately. So let's see, Justin, do you want to go first?
Sure. And so when I joined Braver Angels, I had sort of a hard decision to make, because I didn't really identify very strongly with either political party. And so when I was asked to sort of claim red or blue, I had a hard time doing it, because I voted for candidates from both parties, and I'm basically kind of split 50-50. It's sort of like half the Democratic platform I kind of, sympathize with, half of the Republican platform. But what it made it easier for me to eventually claim red is that although I don't identify strongly with the Republican Party, I do identify, for whatever reason, with the term conservative very, very much. And we can get into that later. And so for Braver Angels, I find that a lot of the writing I'm doing is from a conservative point of view, but not necessarily a Republican point of view. You might describe me as a never Trump conservative, and yet I find myself a lot of times defending the president, because while I'm personally, didn't vote for him, wouldn't vote for him, and share a lot of my progressive friends' concerns, I also find a lot of the concerns about Trump to be a little bit overblown, exaggerated, hyperbolic. And I think that really harms the sort of conversation. And so that's kind of the perspective I'm writing from. And so the last piece I wrote was called Resisting Trump Derangement Syndrome. And this is sort of, as I was just saying, something near and dear to my heart, because although, again, I share many of the concerns, I think that the way they're expressed often make the situation worse. And I wrote that piece right at the time that Attorney General Barr, in what seems now 3 lifetimes ago, gave an interview in which he really criticized the president overtly, very strongly, in saying that his Twitter habit made Barr's job, quote, impossible to do. And the piece was written because instead of celebrating that comment from Barr, which to me seemed like the exact kind of independence that so many Trump critics had been desperate to hear from people in the administration and the cabinet, instead of celebrating it, I was just so surprised that the kind of anti-Trump feeling is so strong that it was instead Barr was criticized as if somehow he were providing cover for the president, or as if somehow, even though he said, Trump made his, Twitter made his job impossible, he didn't really mean it, or he meant something else. And so that's what the piece was about, that even someone like me, who's very concerned about the president, is also concerned about Trump derangement syndrome, which to me seems like a very real thing, and something that's as harmful, maybe not as harmful, but almost as harmful as some of the president's behavior itself.
Yeah, and we can talk maybe a little bit more about that in a little bit. But Randy, what about, you had an interesting piece about Reds and Blues talking to each other. And I appreciate the fact that you have some wine. I felt like the lush in the groups, and I seem to be the only one who took my advice to bring a cocktail. Oh, perfect, Dustin. All right, cool.
Yeah, I clearly felt the need to.
Oh, okay. Now we're all
Your lead there, yeah. I had to step away and grab my glass. Luckily, I had an open bottle because it is Passover, so I have been partaking a little bit. But yeah, I've written a couple of recent pieces that reflect a bit on the health crisis situation that we're living through, and basically our role as braver angels in providing essentially a compass through this time, what role that we can play and that we should play. And I think that, well, so the first piece reflected on the necessity, the centrality of our mission to this very moment, right? So we are going through a time where one of the most paramount concerns and needs for our society is going to be the trust that exists between people within, this essentially social contract of agreement that we're living together, and we're trying to, support the most good. And when we lose the trust of people around us, that they're going to look out for our health, and that they're going to keep 6 feet away, for example, or that that people prepping our food are going to be washing their hands, or people who are sick but feel that they can't afford not to work will actually stay home rather than delivering our mail or delivering our food or things like that. We really need a lot of trust between us at this point, and that trust has been eroded in a major way over the past several years. So our mission comes to the fore, and another part of that article was, at the same time that we are feeling this immense pressure to fulfill that mission, we're also given an opportunity to help, provide people with programming online, giving them something to do, especially in this moment of isolation, when people are craving that connection, right? So we as an organization have been talking a lot about making lemonade out of these lemons of this situation. And I think for me, that has driven me into overdrive. So I've been also, as you mentioned, helping out with leading us to online programming. And I think that that's just so important right now. I've been busier than I have ever been, but it's so immensely satisfying, because I think that the work we do as an organization can just do immense good for this country.
Nice. Michael, what about you? You had a piece published late last week.
Yeah, I think that was mostly one about ideology and basically what people perceive their ideological opponents look like, and that it's mostly, I think, a mischaracterization, because I think that a lot of people, we have a lot more in common than we have differences. And just pointing out some of that, I come from an academic background, and most of our biases are kind of wrung out of us, because if you write up a piece for peer review and it's obviously biased, you're just going to get slammed for it. So you have to basically back yourself up with objective analysis, and that's kind of where I come from. That's kind of where I've come from all along. That this red-blue division is based on some certain real differences, and yet a lot of the differences that we read about in the newspaper are fabricated differences. I mean, it doesn't really matter what music you listen to or what car you drive or anything like that. It matters a lot where you live. It matters a lot how your household formation is. And it matters a little bit about what ideology you believe in, about how people behave. And, that's most of my writing on For Better Angels, Braver Angels, is along those lines.
Yeah, I've been doing that all the time, calling it Better Angels and immediately correcting myself. It's a hard thing.
I kind of like that name better, but I realized it had to be changed.
Yeah.
I kind of like that name Braver.
Braver sounds too self-congratulatory to me, but whatever.
James, you shared recipe tips recently or something like that?
Yeah, maybe hungry.
Okay.
Yeah, right. From a guy whose cooking skills involve microwaving stuff from Trader Joe's.
I'm right there with you.
That's why you have such an appreciation for chili.
Yes. So recently I wrote a couple pieces about America as a chili bowl. And so, I'll provide explanation. This is a metaphor to try to get a metaphor that a lot of people could agree on about, what does it mean to be an American? So historically, there's been a metaphor of a melting pot, but that erases any differences between groups. And then there's a kind of different metaphor of a salad bowl, and that can work if there's dressing and there's some kind of connection, but it's mostly just people who are different are in proximity to one another. They're not really tied together. Salad has kind of views, there's kind of a liberal perception of maybe the salad, whereas chili, right here in DC, there's chili bowl, important to the African American community. Cowboys would eat it. Many Hispanics have chili. So, this is an idea, but a lot of it comes from my interest in mass communication and social psychology and what can bring us together, some of what Michael was talking about. And I kind of messaging almost like an iceberg, right? There's a lot of underlying work and thought, and I can write 2 entire articles about chili bowl, but in the end, it's 2 words, right? And hopefully those 2 words have meaning, that yes, we can still have individual differences and different group identities, but there is a common sauce that unites us.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. I have a instinctual sort of aversion to sort of all-encompassing theories, but I was reading it and trying to pick it apart and finding it difficult to do so. I really enjoyed it. Ruth, what about you? You wrote something a few months ago, right?
I did. Actually, it was around Thanksgiving, and
Okay.
I was anticipating the need for articles, and there were several, about how to speak about politics during Thanksgiving time with presumably family members who disagree. I live in Silicon Valley. It's a very blue area, and I generally vote Republican, although I'm probably more libertarian leaning. And it's pretty petrifying. I mean, you are vilified, called all sorts of names, at least you were, if you had any tender feelings toward Trump, any whatsoever. If you said anything good about him, forget it. You were immediately on everyone's hit list. And I'm really not exaggerating, sadly enough. My kids at that time were in high school. My younger one at some point said something during a political science class, government class, that somebody else interpreted as pro-Trump, even though he didn't intend it to be so. And he was labeled a Nazi, or Jewish, but he's still labeled a Nazi. So anyway, it really concerned me that this type of censorship was happening, very aggressive behavior, and it led to a lot of self-censorship. And I was a philosophy major at the University of Michigan. I was always trained to believe that we should think about all sides of an issue, really volley the ideas around in our own head. And of all things, we shouldn't self-censor. So I wrote an article about that. But I also think that what is equally dangerous, or at least also dangerous, is the idea of pontificating in an effort to win the debate, right? And that's what I saw going on in my kids' high school as well. They were involved in speech and debate, as was I as an organizer. And it was just a vicious battle to the end, and people, in trying to win, would make things up, would study all sides of the issue, but just dig their heels in. And I finally thought, this isn't the proper way of debating. We need to admit what we don't know. We need to ask questions. Training kids to just win is a bad idea. And that's what we're seeing on the higher levels of government too. It's all about winning. It's not about listening. It's not about understanding and finding solutions. So, I wanted to touch on that in my article as well. Admitting what we don't know is important.
That's kind of philosophy behind Braver Angels debates too, is not necessarily winning an argument, but coming up to some sort of group understanding.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I'll go real quick. I have written an article that hasn't been published yet, but it's going to be part of a symposium about who is beyond the political pale, who should be excluded from political discussions in general. And I came down more on the side of inclusivity and allowing a broad range of perspectives, even if that starts to encroach on the line of letting in pretty unsavory characters. And, you know, sort of drawing on the braver aspect of Braver Angels, that might not be a popular thing to do, and might not even in all occasions be the right thing to do, but to draw upon that bravery within ourselves to err on that side of things. And Luke, you're going to be writing something in that symposium as well, right?
Sometime soon here. Yeah, I can't think of
Cool. Anything you want to say about any teas, or are you just we're gonna leave it there and we'll all be surprised?
Well, leave it there and we'll be surprised, because to be honest, I'm sure I'm going to be somewhat surprised too. In the meantime, I haven't written any pieces in the last 3 months or so, but I did have a favorite piece I've ever written for Braver Angels Media. That was about, I think, a year ago almost now, and it was Greg. I don't know if you saw this one, because this was published at a really hectic time for the organization. But about a year ago on Memorial Day, I published a piece called "The Vision of Washington: A Rambling Memorial Day Meditation," and it was my poor international relations major rather than literature major attempt to take the ancient epic tradition of poetry and transmute it into a modern American sense. Here in Washington, D.C., there's always a great Memorial Day parade where reenactors dressed as soldiers from different periods of American history, all the way back to the Revolution, through the Mexican-American War and the War of 1812, through the Civil War, and then the First and Second World Wars, marched down Constitution Avenue with some people dressed up as various presidents, right? And so I wrote a really, really poorly done verse styling of the section of the Aeneid where the hero's father from the underworld tells him of the future history of Rome. So I had a situation of the young George Washington being told the future history of America by the ghost of John Winthrop and John Smith, with those kinds of. And some members of our org, particularly James and also our friend John Wood, talk a lot about how there's a part of Braver Angels that's not just red blue, not just depolarization, but also something vaguely about what it means to be an American, or how you can see your fellow Americans as being really American, right? And so this was more along the theme of that, which is not the center point of what Braver Angels does, but I think an interesting kind of side to it as well. So
yeah, cool.
All
right.
That Luke is a history geek. I think now it's it's readily apparent to anyone listening.
Yeah. He puts us all to shame in that regard. All right, so going back to what I was teased earlier, I hear some babies in the background. Who's got kids? How's it been going?
She's not a baby. She's not a baby. She'll tell you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
She's 6 years old and she runs the house. So.
Yeah. Anybody have kids besides Michael? Ruth, you said you had a few kids, right?
They're big kids, 18 and 20.
Yeah, high school.
Yeah.
How's it been going with quarantining with children? I've heard mixed things from people.
My two boys are getting very hairy.
Okay.
Get a haircut.
Yeah, I just trimmed my beard. It was getting really unruly and developing consciousness.
It's not bad with one. I think people have 3 or 4, then I would say, ooh, that must be tough. But
yeah, I have 3, Greg. 12, three boys, 12, 10, and 8. So we're in the thick of it.
That's
all right.
So I'm in the reverse situation of all y'all. I am the kid living in his parents' basement, and my parents crazy yet, but I'm sure it'll happen one of these days. So.
But feline children, though.
I was gonna say you got a nice cat, right?
I have 4 nice cats, actually.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
But for them, I mean, they're quarantined all the time, and it's basically the same for them, except there's more big, loud, annoying humans around to beg for treats from more frequently. So,
yeah. Cool. All right. So going back to what I was teasing earlier, I mean, well, we had recently a little brouhaha because Trump said what did he say? That he had total authority to return the economy back to normal if he so chose. This caused a little bit of an outroar. And I'm less interested in, again, in the actual comment itself, the passage of time, especially before even this gets released, there will probably be a few new controversies that'll be even more pressing. But I am interested in it because people were talking about, before people's points of views about federalism have seemed to shift a little bit as this has gone on. In the beginning, it was, why hasn't the federal government taken this over and laid the hammer down in terms of its response? And then when things seem to be clicking along, people seem to really enjoy the fact that the governors were taking over. I saw a few articles saying, wow, federalism isn't dead. And then now people are a little bit patient to get the economy going underway, and Trump seems impatient as well, probably because it'll help his re-election chances. And he says, oh, I have total authority. And then people before who said that the federal government should have a very strong response are now saying, whoa, 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 what about federalism? And other people have reversed. So I'm just kind of curious if, we all enjoy federalism when it's convenient, or if the right person is in charge, if we would all feel a little bit, better about the federal government taking a more active role if Joe Biden was president or Hillary Clinton was president, or pick your candidate, Mitt Romney, or if there is something to the states taking back a little bit of their strength and authority and power, and if this crisis has caused any of us to rethink that relationship between the states and federal power. So anybody have, Randy, you have a point on this?
Randy raised his hand.
Yeah.
There you go. I do think that, historically we have seen that people on the right are a little bit more apt to defend states' rights and autonomy of the states, and whereas people on the left do want a stronger federal government to be able to, do things that we see as better for the collective good. I think that in terms of what's going on right now, that I see it differently. That the people, at least from my perspective on the left, have been actually consistent, and they have wanted leadership from the federal government. But in absence of that leadership, we recognize that something has to step into the vacuum. And so in this kind of situation, the federal government has the exact structures with which to coordinate emergency response and to make sure that we have enough supplies in terms of ventilators and masks and all of these things that we need. But that stuff is just not happening. And because of that, we think that it is incumbent upon the governors of the states to step up. And what the joke over the past few days among like late night hosts and pundits has been that they are federating, right? There are pacts that are forming among the eastern states and the western states to coordinate their response.
Yeah.
Why do they have to do that? Because there is no federal government that's actually coordinating that response as it is supposed to do. So we firmly believe that a strong federal government that is good at coordinating these things and making sure we use our resources most efficiently together is very much needed. But if that's not going to happen, then let the states actually replicate that sort of thing, which does make sense.
I'm interested in that because I think we kind of agree, but I see the sort of defaulting to the states in the absence of the federal government's strong response. I guess I don't see that as much of a problem as the states doing what they're supposed to do and what they have the authority to do, and that the federal government's lack of a strong response it doesn't bother me as much, except in the case of equipment not being able to get to where it needs to go. Does anybody else want to kind of expand on that, or anything else that Randy said, or anything in retort?
Well, I think that our system of government and with a separation of powers and a decentralized federal system is perfectly designed to deal with this problem. Okay, I mean, we're supposed to have more local and decentralized control, and we're supposed to have more coordination at the top. And the federal government is meant to coordinate, but it's not supposed to control or produce, okay? And the problem is that if you expect the federal government to start producing like masks, we're in big trouble, okay? So what they are supposed to say, well, I'm looking at 50 states, how do I coordinate the allocation of resources, okay? Either whether they're budgetary resources, whether they're directives of you know, flowing goods and services in one direction or the other. But I mean, it's interesting because I just wrote a piece about that. If my editor would hurry up and get it done. But anyway, but this question of whether it makes sense for America to be one nation, you know, and I don't know how you make a case that it shouldn't be, because we allow people the control over their lives, but then we try to coordinate it at different levels, and it goes upward like that. And it makes perfect sense, much more than the European Union. So you know, that would be my thing, is that if you're looking at this, is you're supposed to have a very complex system. It's supposed to be decentralized and coordinated. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if the top isn't coordinating very well, then you got a problem. So, but it shouldn't be a problem that the whole thing falls apart. It should be able to say, okay, well, I'm a governor of a big state. I'm going to step in and take care of my state the best I can. And I'm going to deal with the governors around my state or in that way. I see no problem with that.
Yeah, just, I mean, when I think about this issue, just to zoom out a bit, I'm always struck by how little as a people we've really thought of this issue of federalism. And it seems like a lot of the arguments that we have between red and blue are often really arguments that are sort of based on unexamined opinions about federalism. And I think that what's kind of happened over time is that, you know, we've drifted, you know, certainly since the Civil War, but certainly in the 20th century, we've certainly drifted toward an understanding of the states having, you know, comparatively little power. But this was never changed constitutionally. And this leads to so many misunderstandings. We have a Supreme Court now, for example, for better or worse, that's very conservative. And they are trying to sort of stick to the letter of the law, right? What the Constitution says. And I think often this gets misunderstood. Even the controversy about the primary last week in is it Wisconsin?
Yeah,
Wisconsin, okay. And where people, of course, were outraged that I guess the federal appeals court allowed the governor to basically say that the election is ongoing. But it was based upon, it wasn't based upon agreeing with the governor that it was a good idea to have the election. It was based on this kind of letter of the law that, you know, we as a federal court do not have jurisdiction over this. We can't tell the governor not to, you know, have this election, so on. And so I think a lot of times we get into tremendous trouble because many, I would even say most Americans, even many Republicans, have moved on from the letter of the law of the Constitution on this issue, but without ever explicitly changing the Constitution. And this leads to so many problems, levels. And I think it's the unexamined base of a lot of red-blue disagreements.
James, I mean, this seems to hit at the heart of what you were writing about in your Chili Bowl article in terms of sort of uniting all these disparate elements at play. You seem to not enjoy that thought, so just take this in whatever direction.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I guess there would be something there. I guess, so, you know, my focus in this field, I tend to have blinders in terms of the questions that I look at. So to me, I mostly focus on how to reduce a topic known as affective polarization. So how do we as individuals kind of feel about the other side, which is typically the other political party. And there's kind of discussions. Eventually, I'll get to the question at hand. What are kind of political parties, and how do people kind of group together? Or is it more about kind of ideology and what government should do, or is it kind of more tribal and group and identity based? And I tend to have more of I think the latter is more accurate, at least today. That when there's something which is honestly to me pretty dry, like what exactly should the power of the federal government be relative to the states, I think that usually takes a back seat to what people want. So I want some government to do something about this, COVID, right? And the federal government's not doing it, so I'll turn to someone else. My background's energy, so with liberals, when George W. Bush was president, they were doing all these alternative energy kind of things in their states because that's what they wanted. So they kind of got this states' rights, like we're laboratories of democracy thing going, not because they cared about that philosophically, but it's because that's the only vehicle that they had to accomplish the goals that they wanted. So I guess my answer is just sort of in terms of tribal and what gets kind of more basic goals is kind of what is emphasized, especially when there's a lot of disagreement between parties and there's less concern about running roughshod over certain norms.
Yeah. Ruth, what about you?
I'm going to take a pragmatic approach and just toss something out. Maybe it's pie in the sky, but to me, it makes perfect sense for the president and the governors to get together, and certainly they can do a nationwide Zoom call and discuss things like adults rather than political animals. Let's put on a show for all of our constituents about how we can discuss issues apart from politics. I think the American public is hungering for that. I think all of them would be reelected if they just show us they can get along and talk like human beings. But instead, there's that trust lacking. Randy, I wanted to follow up on what you said and wrote about food workers not sneezing on the hamburger or whatever. We have to trust that's going to happen. We also have to trust our politicians to get real with us, and they have to trust one another, and they don't right now, clearly. Trump is worried the Democrat governors are going to shut down the economy just to spite him and prevent his reelection. Republicans are kind of going a little maybe nutso in saying, hey, we got to be free, don't force us to wear masks and keep social distance in counties that don't need it. I mean, clearly, in my opinion, those are misguided extremes. And what we really need, apart from, I think, the discussions of whether it's the governor's job or the president's job, is a convention of our governors and our president and our vice president to very publicly talk about solutions and how they're going to get things done.
Well, only Randy, Bill Doherty is gonna moderate that. I don't think it would work if you just put them all in.
Yeah, I don't think so
together.
How could that be done? Yes, I think one of us has to be there.
Randy, going back to what you were saying earlier, I'm just curious for my own sake. If everything were operating ideally in this circumstance, what would the role between the federal government and the states be? You seem to hint. It seemed to me that you hinted you would like to see the states not need to take on as large of a role as they're doing. So do you think if the federal government were at its peak performance, that there would be no role for the states, less role of the states? How would you see that?
No, I actually agree a lot with what Michael said about the states having more authority and the federal government being in charge of coordination, because I think that does make sense. The states really, they're on the ground and they understand the conditions more so within their states, right? So this principle does flow downhill. You look at the interesting dynamic between Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio, which is also broken, right? And they're both Democrats. So, if we can't, if we can't get along within the same party, then what hope do we have across those lines? But really, in an ideal state, It's about the federal government using the leverage that it has to empower the states to be more efficient to serve their people. So, for example, when it comes to sourcing some of these supplies, the federal government is right now not doing a great job of coordinating the purchasing between the states. And what's happening is that the states are competing with each other. And in a normal situation, yeah, that's fine, because the market should determine what pricing is and everything. But the federal government has the power to oversee all of that. And if there's a company that is well positioned to produce certain supplies, the federal government has the right. And Democrats have been really imploring President Trump to act with the authority that he has to compel them to produce things like that. But that authority does have to be relatively limited and more so focused on the coordination.
All right, Luke, do you have any thoughts about that? And if you can, try to maybe incorporate the Oedipus cycle to your response.
It's not the Oedipus cycle, it's the Aeneid cycle. But anyways, all right. The more I study American policymaking at different parts of our history where the political consensus changed a lot, I'm thinking in particular the 1910s, the 1930s, to some degree the 1940s, but then also the 1960s and the 1980s, when you had like these jagged shifts that really realigned what both political parties were thinking about and how they were reacting to the crises. It seems to me that one of the real genius parts of the American system is exactly what Michael is saying and exactly what Justin is saying, is that there are so many dispersed PowerPoints. There are so many different holders of legitimacy that have definable but kind of nebulous relationships with each other. I believe, somebody please correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I believe that for the most part, a lot of domestic policy making right now is constitutionally like in limbo between the states and the federal government. But if a state wanted to dissolve one of its cities or one of its counties to reorganize them, it could do it, and they could do that all the time. So, but that just tells you that the ultimate authority is in the constitutional system, not in the federal government nor in the states. And that means that if you want to get anything done, like FDR wanted in the 30s or like Reagan wanted in the 80s, in terms of big, massive institutional reform of the tax code or of the social welfare system or whatever, you need to get a pretty big, not necessarily a supermajority, but multiple blocks of very different kinds of people onto your coalition. American politics is fundamentally coalitional rather than ideological. And I think one of the reasons why the Trump administration is struggling as much as it is to give the impression that it has a real grip on things, and one of the reasons why it's possible to say that the blue states and the red states are going different directions is just because in American politics at the national level, we haven't really been practicing non-ideological coalitional politics for several decades at least, and because of the fact that you have less successful Republicans in the blue states and less successful Democrats in the red states, it's a lot harder for for a lot of the political actors, both in DC and to some degree in the state capitals, to really be able to make the necessary compromises on this kind of thing. I think I'm not necessarily thinking that we're in a spiraling down crisis mode, but I think one of the reasons why it's uncomfortable to watch these days is exactly that, is that we're not used to making those kinds of trade-offs.
Gotcha. Of course, as soon as I press mute, I get the email buzz. I'm curious as to what you all, how this is making you feel about Braver Angels' work in the depolarization space, because it seems to me that this is almost a Rorschach's test, in that you can look at what's happening in many ways from citizen to citizen, person to person, in terms of some of the outreach that's happening, people donating goods. I was walking around this neighborhood the other day and I saw somebody in front of their house. They had canned goods and books and some sourdough starter and said, please, take what you need. And it seems there's in many ways, people are coming together, and partisan differences seem, at least to me and people I talk to, they seem less acute. People care about that a little bit less, at least in terms of person to person. At the same time, if you look at politics from a national stage and some of the rancor that's happening, it seems just as partisan and divided and petty as ever. So I'm curious as to how you see it all. I tend to gravitate more towards the examples of local action and charity happening in terms of local institutions, churches, Rotary clubs, all of that. And at the same time, if you want to work into your answer, how much of this unity you think can and should last. I tend to be a little bit skeptical of unity. I tend to think that we are unified by a governmental structure, but that allows people to operate independently and to define the good life for themselves. So I tend to be a little bit skeptical of the unity we all feel in a crisis lasting in times of peace. But I'm wondering if any of you think that there is a certain degree of unity that should remain after this is done, and what that would look like. So if anybody wants to just use any of that as a jumping off point, anyone wanna volunteer? Yeah, Ruth, what you think? And then we can go to Luke.
I'll unmute myself. Yeah, I think right now the vibes I'm getting are very positive. I've talked to people off and on, sent people emails and asked them, how are you feeling about the situation? Do you feel that people are becoming more or less politically polarized? And everyone has told me, young and old, less. We just need to hang together and find solutions. So that's very encouraging. Whether that will continue or not, I think depends in large part on the example our politicians and our media set, which I think we need to be brave about telling them, you've got to behave yourselves, guys. Be you Republican or Democrat or somewhere in between. We expect mature behavior. And in terms of how that relates to my feeling about Braver Angels, yeah, I think it's good time for a name change, because I think we have to be very brave and rather loud in saying we just won't tolerate the vitriol. No way. We're here, we're ordinary people, but we're smart, and we don't consider our politicians and our media celebrities any smarter than we are. We want you guys to behave yourselves, whether you're Republican, Democrat. Stop it. Speak your truths, but be civil.
Yeah. Yeah, Luke, do you have anything to add to that? And if you want to also work in like Ruth did, what you think, the role of Braver Angels should be, or if we should approach what we do in a way that's different, or in a way, not to sound crass, but to capitalize on some of the feelings of unity that are happening. What our role is, as just to give you another thing of the 5 things I asked you to think about in your response.
Greg Steinbrecher, social media guy for Braver Angels, talking about capitalizing on a crisis.
Yeah, don't let a good crisis go to waste. I learned,
I think we shouldn't kid ourselves about the lasting effects of trauma to feelings of unity. We all know, some of us were there, some of us were too young to remember, but have heard the stories over the years that on 9/11, America was not united, and the day after 9/11, America was united, and then give it a couple months and Americans are back at their throats again. I actually think that's more or less the norm when these kinds of crises happen, and the greater the crisis gets, the more the sense of unity dissipates, and the sense of obligation to your fellow citizens can really go either way depending on what choices you make. That said, I think there is opportunity for us to commit to something maybe not as big and hoary and abstract as the American nation or the American people. I think there's an opportunity here that especially given that we're all confined to our homes, we're all confined to our localities, is going to, it could be very interesting depending on how the different civil society groups in this space are doing it. But I think the idea of recommitting to institutions that have formed you and that you are a part of and that you continue to serve, be that in the workplace or be that in the classic Boy Scouts, Rotary Club, American Legion, and Church Council, or be that in whichever national civic orgs you happen to be involved with. In our case, Braver Angels, in some of our friends' cases, the think tanks they work with or the party apparatuses they work with. I think there's a sense in which the broader social crisis that we were hitting in the 2010s was about people not feeling like they were a part of something bigger than themselves. And the thing that you can really like turn into a community that is both local and hits the national and even international level is an institution and a civic organization like that. So there's a part of me that hopes that people, in looking for meaning and looking for just things to do with themselves while they're in quarantine over this next couple of weeks, there's a part of me that hopes that you see a spike in people committing to these kinds of organizations that don't necessarily employ them, don't necessarily give them a material benefit, but do give them a way to be part of something. Because fundamentally, America is not only the constellation of the 330 million American citizens. America is also the constellation of the thousands of voluntary communities around this country that we're all a part of in all these kinds of ways. So I think that there is a possibility for unity, but it might not be what we're expecting.
I think Randy, it's looking like you had something to say, and then Justin, we can hit you.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that I have thought for a long time that we, as a generation, particularly the few generations that are in our prime now, we haven't really been part of a national effort that requires any sacrifice. So the generation we call the greatest generation went through a depression and a world war, and it really brought them together. And the difference with 9/11, I think, is that there was a very distinct national trauma, but it didn't involve a long-term sacrifice on behalf of anyone, major swaths of our communities, unless we're talking about having to wait longer lines at to get on an airplane. So, one of the principles that is important for bonding groups, and the military uses this a lot, and in a less honorable sense, fraternities and sororities use it for hazing. But collective hardship does bring groups together. And so I wrote a piece that basically was not that optimistic because of what I've been witnessing on social media and in the news and among our politicians, that says we've degenerated into sniping and really not productive discourse. But I do think that because of the long-term nature of what we're going through at this point, which even when we emerge from this isolation, life will be forever changed in so many ways. And because of that, I do think that it has the potential to make a big change to our mentalities and make us recognize how much we do need each other and should value each other, how much we all contribute to this country.
Yeah. Something interesting I hadn't really thought about, because living in LA and being new freshman in high school at the time of 9/11, still felt it, but somebody described recently 9/11 as a regional tragedy in terms of actually sort of feeling the depths of it, but that this is really much more of a national tragedy in the same sense of the Great Depression, World War II, et cetera. And so I do wonder if it'll foster longer lasting sort of psychic changes. But Justin, you said you had some.
Sure. Yeah, a few thoughts. First, on 9/11, I was a college senior in America, to DC, close to the Pentagon and so on. And although it's true that the sense of unity didn't last a long time, at least my experience of it is that it lasted, almost up until lasted through the invasion of Afghanistan. It was really the Iraq War that broke it. So it's interesting to me sometimes to think what would have happened to that sense of unity in the early 2000s if it hadn't been for the Iraq War. And just a sense of it being regional, there is a sense, I think, in which this crisis, because it affects every single person in the US, even those living in rural, Kansas to some extent, and people have said 9/11 was very different. It affected a few places, but I remember very keenly, I was living in, a small city a year or two later, and the ever-present threat of a terrorist attack in any town in America, which is, maybe it still exists, but certainly not like it felt like in 2002 or 2003. There was a sense then that kind of anybody was affected. So I think, because you could have a terrorist attack, anywhere. And so I do think that that time had a sense of unity that might have lasted longer if this Iraq war hadn't kind of blown it up. In terms of this crisis, I think how long it lasts depends really on the length of the crisis. We shouldn't, obviously we want it to end as quickly as possible, but it's also true that the last time we had an event that led to a sustained period of depolarization was Depression, World War II. Right? These were long events, right? And just like in your own personal life, if you're, if you're sick one night, and you feel better the next day, it might not change you. But if you have cancer and you're out for 6 months or 9 months and you almost die and you're in chemo, right? That has a much greater chance of changing you. And so in a certain sense, while I want this crisis to end as quickly as possible, from the point of view of, is it going to lead to anything lasting? Actually, the longer it lasts, the longer that we are inconvenienced in some sense, the greater chance I think it has of the sense of unity lasting. And then the last thought, I describe myself as a never Trump conservative, and yet I'm super excited and always have been about Joe Biden as a candidate, because I can't think of any politician I have any knowledge of in the last, 20 years, 30 years that is as depolarized as he is. So if you put aside all the views, you might agree with him about everything. You might agree with his policies. You might agree nothing about his policies. But to have someone who authentically in public will say, I have Republican friends. I like, Republicans. These guys are not the enemy. I don't know of any politician in my memory who has talked like that. And so I'm hopeful that with him as nominee out of this crisis, and hopefully the worst of it is over, in the summer and in the fall in time for the election, I think he has a chance in kind of a unique way to keep the unity going, because you have someone at the top of the ticket who really seems to get it. And even if you disagree with Biden about every issue, certainly if he says, I have friends who are Republicans, I like Republicans, I might pick a Republican running mate, which I don't think he'll do, but what's the last time you had a candidate say that? So I'm hopeful that his candidacy, whether he wins or loses in November, can kind of keep the sense of unity going a little bit.
Okay. I might have some disagreements with you about Biden being depolarization camp, but he's your hometown guy, right? So
absolutely, yes.
We can save that for another day. Michael, you got any thoughts on all this?
Yeah, I think it's a long shot, but I'm a kind of a optimistic realist, I'd say. So I don't see this as really going to be some kind of a watershed in our national politics. But it is kind of an interesting case. That definitely we're living through interesting times with this. The thing about a crisis like this is it brings out the best in people and the worst. Okay, and when you relate this back to the need for trust, you realize that in this kind of a crisis, there's group selection. Okay, and so therefore your neighbors are important. Your people in your city are important, and your group, and you're selecting that group because those are the people you trust to get you through this crisis. It doesn't translate very well into cross-group, okay, trust. Okay, so to me, the reaction to this crisis may be like, why am I waiting for Washington to solve my problems? It's never going to happen. What I need to do is focus on my local community, my local government, and things like that. So it's more of a, maybe out of this, people appreciate the decentralization and autonomy of how our system works, that you actually are in control. You can go down to your city council. You're not going to get much, influence in the White House. So, why do we expect that? And so maybe, and the same thing that Luke was talking about, there's lots of other group selections. You have churches, you have volunteer groups, you have community groups, you have schools, and all that kind of stuff, where people go, well, I kind of appreciate that because I know these people and I trust them. And I know that if I go to my local restaurant that I always go to, I trust that they're going to do the right thing in the kitchen, and so that might be somewhat of a lasting effect. But as far as national politics and hoping that politicians will behave better, I don't see much of that really likely to happen. Their incentive structure is just not set up that way. It's just not.
All right. James, do you have a slightly more hopeful note? I know you think about this a lot in terms of our organization's purpose.
As a pundit, no. As a strategist.
Damn it, James. I was counting on you.
But no, actually what Michael was saying, I was going to say very similar things kind of on the pundit side. I do think that this crisis could increase like neighborliness, these kind of, local actions and people, 6 feet apart working together and communicating with each other and supporting local businesses and whatnot. I am very skeptical that it can unify at a national level. Theoretically, it could, that, this is a common other, a common antagonist or enemy, in this case, a virus, and that could bring people together. But, there's so many tensions. And I agree with Michael that the incentive structures just aren't quite right. That, a lot of politicians were voted in because there was so much partisanship and there's negative partisanship. So because they were so antagonistic toward the other side, that made them more desirable. And so that's why they're there in the first place. And it doesn't really make sense for them to just kind of be better when they're there. Exactly. And that gets into resentment but as a strategist, what can we potentially do? I do think there's a lot of, I think about mass messaging. I think, at mass scales, but also very simple emotional kinds of messages. And there's, to throw around maybe too much jargon, something known as recategorization and decategorization. So recategorization is thinking about being part of the same groups. And decategorization is more about thinking of people as individuals. And both of those are ways to kind of bring two opposing groups closer together. And in this case, I think there's a lot of opportunity on both sides of those kinds of messaging ideas to work. We're in this together and we have the same identities as people who are potentially unnerved. What do we do? What's wrong with our economy? We're neighbors and we're friends. And so there are these kind of common identities that we can bring up and say, we're reds and blues both have these common identities. And then, there's a lot of individual characteristics that we can point out and make people more than just this kind of scary stereotype of the other side. So in that case, I think we have a lot of potential to do good, to reduce polarization, even though I think on its own, it's not just going to naturally happen.
Yeah. Interesting. So we'll wrap this up soon. I'm almost out of whiskey, so that seems like the logical place to stop. But I know.
And I need to go get mine.
I thought that was apple juice.
But Luke, I saw you had some movement. You might have some closing thoughts, and then we'll I'll give one last little thing for us to throw out before we wrap this up for good.
Great. Yeah. Well, so I just wanted to thank all of our listeners for tuning in here. You are listening to members of the writing team over at Braver Angels Media. Again, the names are Ruth Ashkenazi, Greg Steinbrecher, Michael Harrington, Justin Naylor, Randy Leaz, James Coan, and Luke Nathan Phillips. And I, as editor of the Braver Angels Media opinion page, I would encourage you to take a look at some of the interesting things that these writers and many others have written. And furthermore, we'll be publishing quite a bit more over the coming weeks and months. Once quarantine lets up, we'll still be publishing, and our goal is to provide interesting and useful content from a variety of perspectives on similar themes to what you heard discussed tonight. Over the course of the year and moving forward from there. So Greg, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks for doing a good job in setting this whole thing up here.
Oh, of course. No, I mean, that seems like it goes as good of a place as any to leave off. Maybe we could just go around in order to sign off one-on-one. Maybe we could even potentially cut this if we do release this as a podcast, but just give a sentence or two about the name change and any experiences you may have had, whether you like it. At first I did not when I first heard it, and then when I started writing my last piece, I realized how much more of an anchor I had and how Braver just felt more grounded and active than just sort of this general sense of better. Braver gave a sense of something to do as opposed to sort of a miasma of understanding. So if everybody wants to just give a sentence or two about your experience with the name change so far, if you got any thoughts about it.
Yeah, I can lead off. So I think there have been a decent number of people who at first blush weren't really too crazy about the name, but it has grown on them, and I count myself as one of those people. We have a pretty strong attachment. I think that we all admire President Lincoln, and there have been some writings in the contrary on our page. But the fact is that I think he is a relatively unifying figure that a lot of people admire, and it is nice to have that connection. On the other hand, what I do think is really important about the work that we do is that not only are these conversations, difficult and complicated and can sometimes go south, but it really takes a lot of motivation to get into these conversations, and just so many people avoid them. So I really do appreciate the fact that our name highlights the courage that is required to not keep to yourself and inquire about what the people around you believe, if you think that what you believe is important, and to engage with them in a productive way, and have the courage to open yourself up to possible criticism, but possible new thoughts.
Anybody else got any thoughts on the name change? Oh yeah, everyone does. All right, so we'll go Justin, James, and Ruth.
For like so many people, my first reaction was not positive, but like so many, it's grown on me. I guess my only concern, and I don't know, it just takes some looking into, what we think about it from the inside is less important than what people who have never heard of the organization think about it from the outside. That's all that matters, because for me, I can really get into it. It's like Braver, right? I get it. Like, it's hard work. It's right. But we can't write we can't give a prospective participant a dissertation on the name. It's got to have some resonance immediately, or it's going to fail. So I can't answer that, but that would be my concern. And maybe the organization, I'm sure some people here can speak to any focus groups or how that went. I don't know, but that would be my concern, is how do people who've never heard of the organization, what does it mean to them? Does it draw them in, or does it shut them down? And that's ultimately the most important thing.
We do have our one-man focus group in the person of James Coan, who is on this episode. So, well,
I think we're all focus groups. Yeah, I don't know why my opinion would matter any more than anyone else's. This is a good segue into some future pieces that are in the pipeline that I've written, and I think Braver makes a lot of sense for those who are very involved in the movement, for those who want to put themselves out there, expend a lot of energy, and right, it can build a certain amount of commitment. To many others, I don't know if it makes as much sense. And I tend to emphasize kind of lower intensity strategies and just kind of messages that can change, even if people don't want to exert a lot of energy or focus on depolarization.
Yeah, Ruth, what about you?
I like the change. I actually liked it from the start. And we were saying earlier how the incentive system for our politicians up high isn't set up for them to be adult and get along and talk things out. But I think that's on us. It was said that we voted in our vitriolic extremists, and we are to blame, and we are. And we need to be brave enough now to face that fact, to change it, to work together, to make sure our politicians and our media know what we expect of them. And it means a lot of work to communicate, stand up. I also want to say that when it comes to the word brave, we have our healthcare workers out there. We have our shop owners. We have a lot of people right now who are brave in the face of a lot of strife. I think it'd be wonderful for Braver Angels to bring those people together, the red shop owner, the blue shop owner, the red healthcare worker, the blue healthcare worker. Let's let them talk and let's listen to their experiences to figure out the next time this happens, and it will happen, we know the right path to take, and it'll be somewhere between the red and the blue. We can do it together.
Ruth was ahead of the curve. She was into the name before it was cool.
All right, Michael, if you don't have any thoughts, and close out, but if you do.
Well, I kind of agree with James and Justin. It's probably doesn't matter too much what I think about it. I kind of liked I kind of liked the allusion to Lincoln, because people got that who are not part of it. And I think it really matters more like how do people outside the organization perceive it? Are they attracted to it, or are they put off by it? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Are they going to fail? Yes, I want to be part of a brave movement, or are they going to think, oh, that's kind of pretentious, you know? So, you know, so I don't know, but I think that's the more important issue of whether it works for the people that we're trying to attract to the movement.
Yeah. Luke, since you did such a good job of closing us out the first time, I'll let you close us out the second time. But before you do that, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating in this. I think it went beyond my expectations. You know, it's so cool to get everyone together and to hear everyone's opinions and your stories, and to talk about it in such a intelligent and compelling way. So I hope we do this again soon.
And Luke, if you don't mind, just before you close it out, if I could just fit in a pitch for people to go to braverangels.org/online to check out all of the activities that we've got going on, that people can join in from isolation. We would love to get a bunch of engagement.
Well, I being an opinion editor, I have an insatiable need to always have my opinion inserted into various things. So I will opine on this as well. I have multiple, sometimes conflicting, sometimes harmonizing thoughts on the name change. Generally, I think it was always going to happen, and it's better than what it could have been. But on the definitely bright side of it, between 2016 and 2020, and April 5th, 2020, lots and lots of people asked me the question and asked other people in our organization the question, oh, are you guys based on that book by Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined? And we always had to answer, no, we have nothing to do with that book, although it's a nice book. But as of April 6, 2020, no one will ever ask that question again, because we do no longer have that particular phrasing in it, and they will always instead ask, what do you mean Braver Angels? At which point we'll be able to explain to them what we are and hook them in on all this kind of thing. So anyways, all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We'll be doing this again periodically. Once again, Ruth, Greg, Michael, Justin, James, Randy, and me. We are only a portion of the great writers in the Braver Angels media community, and if you would like to join our community and write pieces for us as well. There's information on the website. But until the next time, we look forward to seeing you guys next time. So, Greg, thanks again for putting this on.